Hello everyone and welcome again to Hampton Court Palace. I'm back at Base Court to tell you about the Tudors at Hampton Court Palace. So I'm going to turn the camera around so we can scan Base Court while I'm talking. Okay, let's talk Tudors at Hampton Court. So Hampton Court was in fact built originally not by a monarch but by a courtier. The site was acquired in 1514 by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. And Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, as cardinal, so papal legate, was the highest ranking man in the church in England. He was also the highest ranking courtier in Henry VIII's court. He was his chief minister for the first 20 or so years of his reign. Now, he built this palace here to be a magnificent palace where he could accept ambassadors and ambassador groups from other countries. He would do a lot of Henry's work for him, and that included all the foreign relations. So he built a palace, but you don't really go into a competition of who can be the grandest against Henry VIII. And eventually, in 1525, he was, I'd say forced, but it was a good decision to gift Hampton Court Palace to the king. But unfortunately for Wolsey, he was already becoming out of favour with Henry VIII because he was not doing very well in the divorce negotiations between him and Catherine of Aragon, because what Henry basically wanted Cardinal Wolsey to do was secure his divorce from the Pope, and that didn't happen. In 1529, Henry VIII removed Wolsey from Hampton Court Palace, and he began preparing it for his then mistress and he hoped soon to be wife, Anne Boleyn. He also built a new indoor real tennis court, which I've done a video on as well, and two bowling alleys. By this point, he was in his 40s. He still hadn't got a son, and he was less into the risky sports like jousting that he'd been into in his teens, 20s and 30s. So the palace started to be prepared for Henry, and he hoped his new wife, Anne Boleyn. And of course she did become queen, but she never got to use her apartments because by 1536 she had been executed on charges of treason. But in 1537, because Henry was pretty quick at getting his next wives in when his old ones moved out, he was here with Jane Seymour when she went into confinement. There's a very low-flying plane. When she went into confinement, which is what they would traditionally have done about a month before giving birth. And it was at Hampton Court Palace that Henry's only surviving legitimate son was born, Edward, and who went on to become Edward VI. And Edward was christened in the chapel here at Hampton Court. Unfortunately, a few days later, his mother, Jane Seymour, died after complications from the birth. Move on a couple of years to 1539, and this is where the marriage treaty was ratified for his marriage to Anne of Cleves, that very short 6 months marriage that he just was never very into. We're going to go into Henry in Henry VIII month, and we're going to go deeper into his marriages. So in 1540, so only 6 months later, the divorce of Anne of Cleves was confirmed, and he moved on to his next wife, who was Catherine Howard. Unfortunately, Catherine Howard had grown up in a house that had very little discipline around relationships, and she was already quite up with ways of the world, shall we say, and had sexual relationships with other men. And this had come to the attention of Archbishop Cranmer, who was not a fan of Catherine Howard. She was from a Catholic family. He was trying to bring in reformed views, and he took the opportunity to tell Henry about his new wife's past. Nobody would tell the king directly that. He actually wrote him a note and put it in the royal pew in the Chapel Royal here at Hampton Court for Henry to find whilst he was at Mass on All Saints' Day on the 1st of November 1541. with that, Catherine was immediately arrested, as were the men who were under suspicion, and unfortunately during questioning, they dug their graves even deeper. They dug themselves a right hole and started telling about Catherine's current sexual relations with a man called Thomas Culpeper. So that resulted in Catherine Howard's execution at the Tower of London on treason charges. But it was here in 1543 that Henry married Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, and he married her in the Queen's Closet. So basically, when you have the Chapel Royal here, the monarchs wouldn't have. I'm just going to turn the camera around. The monarchs wouldn't have sat in the congregation. They had also like a mezzanine floor, so it was on the first floor, and the King and Queen would have their own room. So. And they would have been accessible from the royal apartments, so they also wouldn't have had to come in and out of the chapel the same way as everybody else. And Henry married Catherine Parr in the Queen's Closet at Hampton Court Palace. But following on from Henry, Mary I used this palace. Her marriage treaty to King Philip II of Spain was ratified here. But after Mary, we had... there's one other thing about Mary I've forgotten to say. So Mary I, in fact, thought she was pregnant. In 1555, she even went so far as to go into confinement this month that they would spend before the birth of their child away from court. She even went to those extents. It turns out it was a false pregnancy, extremely embarrassing, but it was actually a sign of just how poorly Mary was, and she indeed did die 3 years later in 1558. Now, Elizabeth I didn't really favour this palace much. She was the last of the Tudor monarchs. So she did make some alterations. There was a privy kitchen added and a coach house, because coaches had become the new main form of transport, or a bit larger form of transport, and so she had those added to the palace. So that, in a nutshell, is the Tudor story at Hampton Court Palace.